Hi, thank you very much for joining me for another episode of Painting of the Week. And today we are going to be talking about the Japanese artist known as Hokosai. Hokosai is guilty of creating one of our most iconic and ubiquitous images in all of human history. And before I show you that and before we get into his work, I'd just like to quickly touch on the context in which Hokosai lived and worked, which is that of Japan's Edo period, which is a little over 200 years between the 1600s to the 1800s, which was characterized by an extremely strict isolationist policy. So goods, ideas, influences were not exported nor imported from the island during the time in which Hokosai lived. And this is actually an extremely relevant detail when we zoom out and kind of look at the vast constellation of factors that happened in Europe during the 1800s, which really laid the foundation for the modern art movement that we're all familiar with, that we all kind of still live in the wake of. So the image that we all know, the image that is so ubiquitous, the image that is an emoji, the image that I know you've seen before is this image, the Great Wave of Kannagawa. And we know so little about the artist. We know so little about the context of this picture, but we're all really familiar with this image nonetheless. So this is actually one of a larger series of prints called the 36 Views of Mount Fuji, which Hokosai was commissioned to do in his 70s during 1830 and 1832. So this is 1/35 of that whole body of work, which is extremely interesting to think that, like, wow, I'm so familiar with this, but to think there are 35 other images that comprise this series that I've never seen before, that was really exciting for me to find out. And that's what I want to share today in this episode. So I'd just like to quickly note that you do get a view of Mount Fuji here. I had never noticed it until very recently because I'm so kind of inundated with the wave in the midground. But back there we have our view of Mount Fuji. And we're gonna stop and we're gonna very briefly look at some other images from this series. So I've handpicked just a couple images that I like. No big teaching moments here, nothing crazy happening. So we're looking at another view of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji is a little closer to us, but still very much in the background. And I think that this is a fascinating composition because it's a little disorienting because we have all the horizontal lines that kind of give us distance and depth in the background, but then in our immediate foreground we have these 6 or 8 kind of organic vertical shapes coming up. And I think that's interesting. I think that kind of it's not necessarily pleasant on the eyes, but it does have an impact. So I love these images. This one is like a little less easy on the eyes compared to some of the other ones we're going to look at. So when you have all this intersectionality happening between horizontals and verticals in your picture, that's going to create for some distress in your viewer. But that's obviously an intentional tool being used here, and it's really quite a nice image nonetheless. So we have another view of Mount Fuji here, and now Mount Fuji is way pushed in the background. And one thing that I really like about this image is the type of atmospheric perspective is created because we have more information in our foreground. So the things that are closer to us, we have more information, and as we go further and further back in the picture, we have less and less information. And that's just kind of atmospheric perspective 101. But I just love the way the artist has created distance here in the picture. Because we see this boat in front of us with tons of information, we can see the figures in it, and then we can see other boats kind of in the mid to background area, and there's less and less information happening here. So that really is a visual trick, which is kind of creating depth within a flat plane, and that's really cool. The other thing I'd like to say is the way Hokosai has rendered water in the foreground is really nice. And if you were to comb through all 36 of these images, the way he represents water is just so interesting and so dynamic, because we know kind of that iconic water and wave from the Great Wave. But here he's kind of articulated a different type of water. So here we have our last view of Mount Fuji for the day. I really enjoy this picture. It was really hard for me to pick just a few of the 36 images that Hokosai represented for this series. I mean, I experienced them to all be really easy on the eyes, really visually relaxing, really pleasant, both in their composition and in the colors that are used. And then there's kind of this everyday way of life narrative happening in these pictures that just feels like really a time capsule into a part of the world that I'm not familiar with, in a period of time that I'm not familiar with, that I didn't live through. So I just absolutely adore these images. And I did pick this one because there's, for me compositionally, there's something really pleasant happening here, which is that in our foreground and our midground up until the water, we have a lot of information, and in our background, we have a lot of information, but it's really broken up by this horizontal cloud shape, which is not over-rendered. So Hokosai has really provided us with a resting place for our eye as we move through this picture. So it's a lot of information, break, more information. And I really enjoy that. And I know that was thought through intentionally. So again, it was really hard for me to just choose a couple of these because I find them all so enjoyable. And maybe if you're so inclined, you can check out the 36 views, and maybe you'll experience them to be the same. But regardless, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.